Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are on. I got ink all over my hands. I had a jar of ink explode on me. Very fun. But anyway, we are doing again yet another art supply tour, and today I figured I'd delve into something I don't talk about much, which is my brushes. So we'll just do a little tour of my brushes, and unfortunately I can't lay them all out nice and neat on my desk here. My desk is actually on an inclined angle now. The lighting is different. I'm doing a lot of modifications to my setup right now. Like if I actually move this and expose my light box, you can see like there's lights there's a light there, there's a light there, there's a light there, just light on light on light. Very well lit. But it helps break the shadow a little bit. Anyway, to the brushes. Just do a little tour. I'm going to start off with the brushes I don't use very often. And then we're going to segue our way into the... We're going to move on into the brushes that I use a lot more frequently. The first brush that we have up here is this little color shaper brush. This is actually a brush that I use with liquid frisket, masking fluid. And that's all that this is used for, is for applying liquid frisket for any time I'm doing splatters or anything like that. And then I can remove the mask from the artwork, typically through the use of a kneaded eraser. The next brush in my collection is this King Art Premium 10 Original Gold shader brush. This came in a subscription box, and kind of just don't really use it, but you can see that there is some ink that built up in there. I have tried using it before, but I don't know. It's in my collection. The next brush is this Princeton Art 5/0 brush. Never use this thing. It's a 5/0 round. It is super tiny. I typically will only use it for white corrections from time to time, but I typically never use that brush. The next brush in my collection is this Princeton Velvet Touch size 8 long round. It is a very large brush, and it comes to an extremely fine point. This brush actually has an amazing point to it. I was originally using this brush to spot blacks, but surprisingly, it actually holds ink less well than a sable brush does that's, say, a size 4, because this is a synthetic brush. But the point on it is extremely nice. So I will use this from time to time when going from spotting blacks to more detail work, just for speed purposes. Sorry about that, and we are back. So moving on to my next brush. The next brush is this Princeton Glacier synthetic brush. It's a size 2 round. This is actually the brush I use for my corrections. I try to keep my brushes for my whites and my blacks separate. Oof, that sounded terrible. But anyway, and that's just, sometimes you're not going to get all the ink out of the brush, and you don't want to dip your brush into a white ink and have some of that black ink reactivate and be painting gray on your paper. So this is typically the brush I use for my corrections with opaque whites. All right, this is a Dynasty Fine Kolinsky brush, size 2 round. This is a brush I actually picked up from the Kubert School, and they were just recommended it as an alternative to the Raphael brush that I normally use, and I was buying a backup Raphael brush at the time, and I said, hey, why not? Let's give it a try. It's an okay brush. For someone on a budget, I'd probably recommend it, but I do have a budget brush that I recommend more. And that leads us to the budget brush that I recommend more, which is the Vinci Maestro series. These are Kolinsky Sable brushes. They are substantially cheaper than, say, a Raphael 8404 or Winsor Newton Series 7, the Series 7 being the most expensive of the bunch. But I find that they perform extremely, extremely well. Now, this is a Series 10 round 2. which works very well. But the point is more along the lines of like a Winsor Newton point. The belly of the brush itself is not very large, nor is the length of the bristles very large. So it does not hold as much ink as, say, a Raphael 8404 would. The performance of it is still a great brush, though. It comes to an amazing point. As you probably can't tell, as this brush has no preserver or anything on it, but if I just swirl it around real quick, you can see that this brush does come to an extremely nice point. I find that these brushes work very, very well and can handle themselves to the likes of a Raphael or Series 7. These are the only brush that I recommend outside of Raphael or Winsor Newton brushes in the Kolinsky Sable family. I am extremely pleased with these. That's my number 2. What I find that I spot my blacks with the most is the Vinci Maestro Series 11, which is more like an English bellied round, which is a little bit shorter with a wide belly. As you can see there, it holds a lot of ink and it still snaps to a great point. And yeah, I mean, you can actually do line work with this if you don't oversaturate the brush with ink. This is a Da Vinci Maestro Series 35 Kolinsky, which is a long pointed round. Now this brush comes to an extremely, extremely fine point. I can get lines out of this brush like I can a size 2 Raphael. This is kind of my happy medium brush. This is kind of like that long pointed 8 round that I showed by Princeton, except good. Not that the other one's not good. It does have great snap, but this is a Kolinsky brush. It holds ink amazingly, and the line work that I can do with this is amazing. And this was actually my first Da Vinci brush that I bought and was extremely impressed by it, and it led to the purchase of the other brushes. So I highly recommend these brushes in all sizes. They are amazing brushes, and even if you're doing watercolor, these brushes are fantastic. And here is my collection of Raphael brushes. Some 8404s, mostly a couple 8408s. The difference between the 8404 and the 8408 is the point, and I'll show that here. So here you have on the left an 8404 and on the right an 8408. And the 8408 has the same length hairs, but it has a smaller belly, so it has overall less hairs. And this comes to an extremely snappy point and is great for detail work. But on the downside, it does hold less ink. Whereas the 8408 has a very large belly, holds a lot of ink, and you can get a lot of line work done with the 8408. However, I find that the 8404 has a little bit less snap than the 8408. So when I'm really getting in and doing tiny details and I'm just flying through stuff with the brush, I'm typically using the 8408. However, to be quite honest with you, the 8404 is my go-to brush. In fact, this particular size 2 8404 is my first Raphael brush, and I've had this brush for about 6 years. The 8408 brush I've had for probably about 4 years. The next brush I have is a 8404 size 3. I have a weird theory about brushes and the way they work. I find that the larger the brush and the longer the bristles, so that's typically synonymous with each other, the more the brush acts as like a shock absorber and will give you a steadier and smoother line. So there are a lot of times where I'll use a size 3 brush instead of a size 2, just for the feel of the brush. However, I would say that my go-to brush 99% of the time is this Raphael 8404 size 2. This is a size 4, purchased for kind of the same reason as the size 3. This is a brush that I will do some line work with, but this is a brush that I tend to spot blacks with. Has a great belly on it, holds a lot of ink, and it's still capable of a fairly fine line. However, I find that the point on my size 3 and my size 2s is better. But it's a brush that I have and it gets used from time to time. I'm going to put some of these brushes back just so we can contrast again between the 8404 and the 8408. So both of these are size 4s. In fact, this is the first time I'm uncapping my size 4 8408. But again, you can see the difference. As you can see, the 8408 has a thinner belly and comes to a more consistent taper. than the 8404. I purchased the 8408 size 4 as more of a detail-oriented brush because I wasn't completely happy, like I said before, with the point on the 8404 size 4. So I wanted to get something that I could still hit those large areas with, but have a finer point. Again, at the expense of holding less ink. However, I've never used this brush as I've really been fond of that Da Vinci 35 size 4. So never used this brush actually. And that completes my collection of Raphael brushes. Now we'll move on to my Winsor & Newton. These are my Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. We'll go through here, showcase these a little bit. Now you'll notice that both of these are size 2. What I have is I have a miniature size 2 and a standard round size 2. The standard round size 2 I've had for about 5 to 6 years. I've always typically used Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. When I started buying new brushes to replace my old brushes, this was bought around the same time as my Raphael. When I first got the Raphael, I was having a hard time getting used to the difference in it, which we'll discuss at the end of the video. But I then purchased a new size 2. This is a miniature size 2, and as you can see, the difference is not only the belly, but the length of the hairs. And the length of the hairs, the shorter hairs, give this brush a little bit more snap. Actually, it gives it a lot more snap and a more nib-like kind of response. So I kind of thought that this might be my go-to inking brush when experimenting. However, I find that I can actually get a finer line with the longer bristles, and that just has to do with the taper and everything. And when you load up the ink, this oversaturates with the ink a lot quicker than this does, and this regular round will hold ink a lot longer than the miniature will. This is my Winsor Newton size 3 brush. This brush has been used not very much, but honestly, this is probably the best brush I own. The snap on this brush is amazing. The response to it, everything about this brush is probably as good as you can get. This is probably the best brush I use. For whatever reason, I think it's the fear of ruining the brush that I don't use this brush as much as I should. But this brush is fantastic. It is probably one of the best brushes I've ever used in my life. That's why I keep this thing like double, triple protected. Just like with my Raphael collection, I have a Winsor Newton Series 7 Round 2. This brush has never been used. That's the first time I've uncapped it. This brush is simply a backup to my existing Winsor Newton Series 7 Round 2. In case anything ever happens to the brush, I don't have to rush out and buy a new one or figure out what I'm going to do. Now, between all the brushes, these are my most commonly used 2 brushes for inking line work. The Winsor Newton Series 7 on the bottom and the Raphael on the top here. Now, if we look and line these up side to side, you'll notice that the Raphael is slightly ever so longer with the hair length, but it's negligible. The biggest difference being the belly of the brush. Now, I will say that the Winsor Newton Series 7 size 2 has more snap. I would equate the 8408 more along the lines to the Series 7. Let's throw the 8408 in the mix there. You can see that the 8408 here on the left is a lot more similar in dimensions to the Winsor Newton Series 7 in the middle, with the 8404 on the right. So this actually is an order from left to right of belly size. The Series 7 does have a little bit larger belly than the 8408, with the 8404 having the largest belly of them all. And that really comes down to ink capacity. So what do I think of the brushes? Well, these are my most commonly used brushes. Which brush I use at the time is really, it's whatever brush I grab, to be honest with you. This brush doesn't get used very much, the 8408, because typically I find that the Series 7 produces the same results. Now, what I do notice is that between these two brushes, let's talk about these because they're the most similar. The Series 7 does saturate quicker or oversaturate quicker. And when it oversaturates, this particular brush has a tendency for the tip to split. Whereas these do not. My Raphael brushes don't have the tendency for the tip to split as it's holding too much ink. But just running some of the excess ink off brings this to a great point and has amazing snap. Whereas this one just tends to get wider and you just won't get a fine line out of it. And that's the same is true with this. However, I find that these brushes, the Raphael brushes, tend to develop a bend in them, which you actually might see as I rotate the brush around. Although I tend to keep my brushes pretty well conditioned, but the snap, how well it comes back to its true direction. I find that the Raphaels aren't quite as good as the Series 7. This thing will stay straight constantly. So this is my preferred brush. The Winsor Newton Series 7 size 2 is my preferred brush for doing any type of rendering or feathering or anything like that. But I still often grab this brush just because over the last 6 years, I have used this brush extensively and it holds more ink. So I don't know. It's really a toss-up between these brushes. But that is my brush collection. I was going to include my brush pen collection in this, but I think just due to the sheer number of brush pens I have, I think that's going to wait for another video. But what brush you choose to use is really up to you and your budget. Raphael brushes, depending on the size, can get pretty expensive, as can definitely the Series 7s. So if you don't want to spend $20, $30, $40, $50 on a brush, I would probably say avoid the Raphael and the Winsor Newton Series 7. Although a Raphael 8404 size 2 brush does only run you about $20 or less, I think. I don't know what the going price of the 8404 size 2 brush is. The recommended size I would recommend would be a 2 or a 3 brush, depending on what you want. If you want a little more forgiveness, I would use a 3. If you want a little more precision and response, I would go with a size 2. But if you don't want to drop a lot of coin on a Raphael or a Winsor & Newton, the brush I would recommend is the Vinci Maestro series. Be it the 11, the 10, the 35. They're all great brushes. The size 435 is probably one of the brushes that impressed me the most because of the variety of lines I can get from it. It has a super long point, as you can see, between the standard size 4 and the 35, so it really has that shock absorber quality. It holds a fantastic amount of ink. The Da Vinci size 2 here, compared to the Series 7, as you can see, it even has a finer belly. So it's a thinner belly and shorter bristles. So this brush has a lot of snap to it, is extremely controllable. The problem I have with this brush is it doesn't hold as much ink, but this is still an amazing brush. So for anybody on a budget, I would look at the size 2 Da Vinci brushes or maybe the size 3 or 4. If they have a series 35 size 3, that would probably be the brush I would recommend for someone who's getting started in brush inking. So there you have it, everybody. My collection of brushes, and brush care is very important. Always use a mild soap and a preservative on your brushes, and you can get fantastic life out of your brushes. As I said, my oldest brush that I have on me right now is my 8404 size 2, and I've had that brush for 6 years, and it's still performing today the way it did when I got it. So take care of your brushes, whichever brush you choose to use. Now, I typically do not recommend synthetic brushes. While their points and snap are amazing, they do not hold a lot of ink. However, I have been impressed by Princeton brushes, and you can get some decent Winsor & Newton synthetic or red sable brushes, but I would say go for the Kolinsky if you're going to go all the way. Otherwise, play with some synthetic brushes. Just understand you're going to have to re-dip them in ink more, and it's harder to control that fine line of where your ink level is between it being too much and too little. Anyway, guys and gals, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, comment and subscribe. Take care.